spend many happy afternoons with my children in this bookstore, anonymously wandering around, and here I am. And it makes me miss them. Of course, I miss them, but I also miss them as they were on those long summer afternoons. So it is a thrill to be here. I love Concord, and it's just. I'll try. That's why I'm standing up. I have this very low voice, so keep reminding me. Okay. So I'll tell you what. When my voice goes down, put up your hand, and then I'll bring it back up again, because I have to focus on projecting. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the book for a few minutes, like maybe 8, and then about how I came to write it, blah, blah, blah. And then I'm going to read 3 short, and I mean short, 1-page segments of the book, and I'm going to tell one story about Louisa May Alcott, and then I'm going to answer your questions, or try to answer your questions. That's my plan. So in 1843, in April, Sophia Peabody, who was married to Nathaniel Hawthorne, as I'm sure you all know, and they were living in the old manse that way. And of course, it was a house that they had because of Emerson's generosity. It was a rented house, although they didn't always pay the rent. And Sophia, for reasons that I'm not sure of, took her diamond engagement ring and started scratching in the window. And one of the things that she scratched out was, man's accidents are God's purposes. So I have a man's accidents version of how I came to write this book, and I have a God's purposes version of how I came to write this book. And in my experience, that's the way the good stuff happens. It looks like an accident, and then when you look back, you go, oh, destiny, of course. So anyway, the accident version is in 1999, I was talking to my agent, complaining to her, as one does, and she said, why don't you just shut up and write an introduction to this new Random House version of Little Women? They need someone to do it, you can do it. So I said, fine. I thought I had read Little Women. I had read it when I was 18. I had seen the movie. So I read Little Women, and I was just amazed. It's an extraordinary book. It's a great novel. It elevates domestic details to a new height. It's suffused with the kind of yearning that makes great literature. I was just blown away by it. So then I read, then I turned to Martha Saxton's wonderful biography of Louisa May Alcott, written in 1977. And there I found that, according to Martha, the boy next door in Little Women, Laurie, was actually based on Henry David Thoreau. So I didn't know that. So then I kept reading, and I found that the book that Louisa May Alcott thought was going to be her great novel, her breakthrough book, the book that was going to put her on the map, was a novel called Moods. So I didn't know that. So I got hold of Moods, and I read Moods, and then I found that Moods hadn't done well at all, and it partly didn't do well because it got a bad review from Henry James. So then I thought, what is going on here, right? I mean, what is this little town, this little crossroads, actually, although it's a pretty spread out crossroads. I just drove through it, and I thought, ooh, crossroads? Maybe not. That caused all these great writers to come together in this amazing way. And so I became obsessed with Concord. Maybe you saw me, maybe you didn't, but every time I was going anywhere, I would end up here. And at first, the first time, this is in the book, the first time I came, it was August, I guess of 2000, and I had been reading everything, and I expected it to be 1840 on the mill dam, right? And I got stuck in traffic 3 miles out. And I had 3 kids and 2 dogs in the car. And we got around here, and I was able to park in back of a store somewhere, but the kids were already, let's get out of here, let's get out of here. And anyway, I insisted that we go to the Old North Bridge, and we got to the Old North Bridge, and there were people everywhere, and the kids wouldn't get out of the car. So that was the first visit to the Concord, what I thought was going to, so I kept coming back, and it took me a while, but I was able to piece together Concord of 1840, because the pieces are still here, especially in February or March or January. It's just when you come in August, they're kind of covered over. So I ended up feeling very connected to these people because of everything that's still here and everything that is so beautifully preserved. So then I thought, well, maybe this is a book. You know, I was obsessed. And also I discovered the Great Western, which takes children and dogs. So that solved a lot of my problem. I mean, the Best Western, sorry. Anyway, so then I thought, well, I'll write a book, and I told my publisher, and it took me a year to convince my publisher that this was a book. And I finally convinced them, and then I wrote a book. So that's the accident version. Then, when I finished the book, I thought, you know, the very first trip my father took me on was to Concord, was here. When I was 11 years old, for reasons that I don't know what they were, my grandmother lived in Quincy, we came up to Quincy, and he brought me up here by bus, and we went to Orchard House, and we went to the old manse and saw Sophia's scribblings, and we went to the Emerson house, although I'm not sure we went in, and he wanted me to see this, and I thought, well, so maybe I was interested in this sort of without knowing it. And then I remembered that at college I was an American Studies major, and that I wrote about Hawthorne, and that my thesis was about Henry James and Edgar Allan Poe, and that the book I studied, or the book that I came away from college with, was F.O. Matheson's American Renaissance, which is, of course, a version of this story. So then it began to seem as if it was destiny. So those are the two ways in which I can tell the story. And of course, many, many, many great, brilliant, erudite men, and some women, but mostly men, have written about this group of people. Thoreau, Emerson, Whitman, starting with F.O. Matheson, Perry Miller, Robert Richardson, Lawrence Buell. However, the more I read, even Carlos Baker wrote about the community, an amazing book called Emerson Among the Eccentrics. They all left out the women. And since I had started with Louisa, I, you know, felt that I was coming at it from a slightly different angle. Although I am not, certainly, I'm not a Harvard scholar. I'm an amateur rather than an academic. Not that there's anything wrong with academics. My daughter's one, so I love them. All right, I'm going to read the first page of the book, which is a kind of introduction, and then I'll talk a little bit, and then I'll read another page, and then I'll tell you the Louisa story, and then I'll read another page, and then you'll ask me questions. And I hope it'll take about 20 minutes. You know, sometimes it takes half an hour, and sometimes it takes 2 minutes, and I don't seem to have much control over that. So it should take about 20 minutes, which is what it's supposed to take. Concord, Massachusetts. Oh, it is so amazing to be here. And aren't you lucky to live here? Oh, what an astonishing place. Okay, the crossroads, where the swampy meadows below the Cambridge Turnpike rise steeply to the orchards on the other side of the Lexington Road, looks like any New England corner. Shaded by maples, it is bordered by lush grass in the summer and piles of plowed snow in the winter. On the high side, 2 clapboard houses sit near the road. Across from them, a white house with a columned entrance is surrounded by lawns. It's the kind of house an ordinary merchant might have owned in the 19th century, but this intersection is an extraordinary place. At various times, these 3 houses were home to Ralph Waldo Emerson and his family, Henry David Thoreau, Bronson Alcott and his daughter Louisa May, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Margaret Fuller. Their neighbors were Henry James and his father, Emily Dickinson and Oliver Wendell Holmes, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and Horace Mann. Their friends and colleagues were Walt Whitman, Herman Melville, Henry Ward Beecher, and Edgar Allan Poe. From their collaborations with each other and the Concord landscape came almost every 19th century American masterpiece. Walden, The Scarlet Letter, Moby Dick, and Little Women, to name a few, as well as the ideas about men and women, nature, education, marriage, and writing that shape our world today. Can you hear me? Am I doing okay?
A little louder.
Louder. Okay. We may think of them as static daguerreotypes, but in fact these men and women fell in and out of love with each other, edited each other's work, talked about ideas all night, and walked arm in arm under Concord's great elms. They picked apples together in the autumn, struggled with horses and carts through the spring mud, and swam in the Concord River in the summer. They mourned together when the Emersons lost their 5-year-old son, and rejoiced together when Anna Alcott married John Pratt. They bought and sold from each other, sometimes driving a hard bargain, and sometimes failing to distinguish between a gift and a purchase. Thoreau talked Hawthorne into buying his handmade boat, the Musketaquid. The Alcotts sold the Hawthornes their house, an old pig farm fixed up by Bronson Alcott, and later they moved into the wreck next door. As usual, Emerson gave them a loan. When Hawthorne babysat his 5-year-old son Julian while his wife went to visit her sister, Herman Melville dropped by to help. So, this group of people is what is called a genius cluster. And a lot has been written about genius clusters over the years by a variety of sociologists and historians. And there's a lot of interest in what creates a genius cluster. Another genius cluster was our founding fathers. Washington, Jefferson, Adams, there's a genius cluster. And it seemed to me in this instant, and often, that a genius cluster requires a charismatic, stubborn, central figure, sometimes somebody with quite a lot of money. I think it's like alternative education in this way. You kind of need a leader who makes it happen, and Emerson was certainly that person. He came here, he bought that big White House, and he started inviting people to Concord. He invited the Hawthornes, he invited the Alcotts, he invited Franklin Sanborn. So that's my theory at the moment about genius clusters, is that they require a puppet master, so to speak. And Emerson was a magnificent puppet master. He really created an astonishing community, as you know, and as I recount. Okay, here's chapter 13, which is about Nathaniel Hawthorne and Sophia Peabody, and again Emerson. It's called The Execution. Water. I don't usually swig, but... The wedding of Nathaniel Hawthorne and Sophia Peabody took place in the Peabody parlor on West Street, after which Sophia and Hawthorne set out for Concord in a carriage. Hawthorne's sisters did not attend. The execution took place yesterday, Hawthorne wrote his sister Louisa. We made a Christian end and came straight to paradise, where we abide at this present writing. In the delicious discovery of individual importance, the seductions of nature, and the delights of European things, how am I doing? No?
Louder.
Okay. In the delicious, you know what, let me start this page again, okay? Yes? Sorry about you guys who already heard it. Okay, the wedding of Nathaniel Hawthorne and Sophia Peabody took place in the Peabody parlor, took place in the Peabody parlor on West Street, after which Sophia and Hawthorne set out for Concord in a carriage. Hawthorne's sisters did not attend. The execution took place yesterday, Hawthorne wrote to his sister Louisa. We made a Christian end and came straight to paradise, where we abide at this present writing. In the delicious discovery of individual importance, the seductions of nature, and the delights of European things among the group of people who gathered in Concord, there was a tremendous strain on all things conventional, and the institution of marriage was no exception. How could the men and women of the newness, that's what they called it, reconcile their desires for each other with an old-fashioned way of doing things that had been seemingly invented by the Puritans for their own protection? It wasn't just Hawthorne who compared marriage to execution. Emerson quoted Byron as saying that the process of love to marriage is like wine to vinegar. And he also liked what the British physician Thomas Wharton said on marriage versus hanging. Hanging is the better of the twain, sooner done and shorter pain. Later at night, if he was talking, he would quote Sir Thomas More's opinion that getting married is like putting one's hand in a bag containing 99 snakes and an eel. Bronson Alcott, in his Consociate Society, believed that marriage shouldn't limit a man's ability to be with other women, or a woman's ability to be with other men, a freedom that rang hollow to his wife, who had no desire to be with other men, and less desire to be with Alcott. Am I doing okay? You're laughing, so I think you're good. Great. Okay, so that's that page, and that's Emerson and Hawthorne and how things went around here. I also want to say, now I'm going to read about Thoreau. I want to point out that you can tell I'm not an academic because I pronounced Thoreau incorrectly. Right? You're supposed to say Thoreau. And I haven't seen the evidence that that's what he said. So when I do, I'll change. But I'm very aware that, you know, this is an outsider's pronunciation. But you'll forgive me, I hope. Okay, now I'm going to read just a page and a half about, I'm going to tell the Louisa story. Okay, this is one of the stories that really got me going. For obvious reasons, it seems to me. When I was just beginning and reading about Louisa May Alcott and her incredibly interesting and sad and happy life, I came to the story, which is both in Martha Saxton's book and in a couple of other books, of how she came to write Little Women. And she had, of course, written Moods, which didn't do well. And then she actually went, I mean, she was an unbelievable woman. She went south to Washington to become a Civil War nurse. And even though she had probably never seen a naked man, she, you know, night after night nursed these dying and wounded men. I mean, unbelievable. Then she came back, she got very sick, came back and wrote Hospital Sketches, which is sort of the first book in her mature style. And it is an amazing book. So she thought, okay, I'm launched. So she goes to her publisher and she says, what am I going to write next? And he says, well, the only thing I could possibly sell that you might write would be a book for teenage girls, young girls. I'm paraphrasing. And she said, no way. No way. After everything I've been through, I'm not going to write a book for young girls. I'm not going to write what she called moral pap for the very young. That's what she called it later. I'm not doing it. So she was in Boston, she was having her life, and she was very determined, and she turned him down flat. So he wrote a letter to Bronson Alcott saying, gee whiz, again, I'm paraphrasing, your daughter should really be writing a book for young women, and she won't do it. So Bronson wrote a letter to Louisa saying, you know, your mother is starving, your sisters are starving, the house is falling down, you know, Bronson could never make money. You need to come home and write this book. So Louisa, in a rage and very, very sick, she had been given mercury in Washington, and that, you know, she was one of these unfortunate people who were given mercury. So very, very sick and in a rage, came back to Concord and sat down at that little desk that you've all seen on the second floor of Orchard House that her father had built for her, right? Just furious. And, you know, in 6 weeks wrote one of the best-selling books of all time. And one of the best books of all time. So that really, I love that story. And another interesting aspect of that story is, you know, they didn't have old age then. They didn't have what we have. And she was, at that point, she was a disappointed, angry, very sick spinster of 36. So that gives you an idea of how lucky we are. Okay, now I'm going to read about Thoreau, and then you'll ask me questions. Does that sound good? Does that sound right?
Perfect.
Okay. We revere Thoreau for his contempt for material things. We love him for damning new clothes and cautioning us against possessions. We like his judgment that other men and women are leading lives of quiet desperation. But we love him because we are swamped with things, because even the simplest of us could not list our possessions in a few lines or even a few pages. In a world where materialism has eclipsed religion, Thoreau's messages have a different ring, than they did in a world where religion was changing and materials were few. Walden is a masterpiece, but it is generally cited more than it is read. The mention of Walden in polite society inevitably, how am I doing? Can you hear me?
Louder.
Louder, okay. Walden is a masterpiece, okay? Thanks for being my canary, my bellwether. Okay, Walden is a masterpiece, but it is generally cited more than it is read. The mention of Walden in polite society inevitably elicits great praise. My favorite book, someone says, or I live by that book. What they mean is that they know about the book, and they take it to be a handbook for the simpler life they might want to lead if they ever got tired of making money, or going to parties, or if they ever came to believe that the status in their community that makes them comfortable was really not important. They remember a few of the aphorisms often excerpted. Beware of all enterprises that require new clothes, for instance, or simplify, simplify, simplify. They haven't read the book in a long time, and perhaps that's just as well. Thoreau is not kind to the rich, or even the middle class. He also advances some of the most brilliant arguments for being a vegetarian and for abstaining from drinking that have ever been written. So it's good that they haven't read it, or they'd be upset. A day at Walden often started early. As the rising sun, I just have to tell you a Walden story. I was asked to read, there's a program where writers select their favorite classic, and then they go before an audience of the trustees of the New York Public Library and talk about the classic. So I hadn't reread Walden, right? So I picked Walden. And then I reread it, and I thought, you know, I'm going to go before a group of very wealthy people and talk to them about this angry, anti-wealth book. And I was terrified. But either they hadn't read it, or they were extremely polite, because it went all right. But when I reread it, I was just, again, amazed. It sounds stupid, but just amazed at his anger. A day at Walden often started early as the rising sun dyed the world a bright pink. In the summer, Thoreau would sometimes swim in the pond that lay before him. In the winter, he would start a fire and warm himself as the morning train from Boston to Concord rattled by on the tracks next to the pond. Mornings, he read or wrote in his journal or worked on his book. Thoreau ate little. A piece of bread dipped in honey was his idea of a meal. And if he also had an apple or some beans, it was a feast. In the afternoons, if he didn't walk the mile into town to visit the Emersons or his mother or another friend, he would sometimes go fishing or play the flute. Thoreau's retirement from the community was not meant to be a social retirement. The truth was that he needed a place to live. Even when he didn't go into town, he ran into the Irish families who were still around Concord from having worked on the railroad, or other people who had come out to Walden to fish or swim. In the evening, the bullfrogs would start up in the marshes at the end of the pond, and as the last train to Boston went past, its windows lighted up from inside, the fireflies came out, and he could hear carriages rumbling over wooden bridges to the east, and the lowing of someone's cattle, and the barking of a far-off dog. Some evenings, a flock of geese would come honking into the pond for a noisy landing just as night fell. Thanks. If you ask questions, I'll try to answer them loudly.
What kind of research did you do for your book? And where did you do it?
I did a lot of research. The book, I mean, I wrote another book at the same time, but it was about 6 years worth. I did a lot of it at the New York Society Library. I was very, very grateful, since I don't live here, that so much had been written about these people. So many of the books in my bibliography had been published. I could find them anywhere. Also, Louisa's journals, Louisa's letters. had been published. A lot of these things have been published. I also went to the Houghton Library at Harvard, which is the most wonderful place on earth. You walk in there, you show them your driver's license, and they give you Emerson's actual letters to Margaret Fuller to look at. I mean, it is amazing. I was unable to do research at the Concord Free Library because when I was doing the research, the files had all gone to Acton, remember, because the library was being renovated. So I didn't work there. I worked at the Houghton. But mostly I was able to use secondary sources just because so much has been written about them. Yes?
You spoke about Margaret Fuller. How come a lot of people don't include her in it?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, Louisa May Alcott's been marginalized and Margaret Fuller's been forgotten. And Margaret Fuller was an essential part of the transcendentalist community. They didn't call themselves that, but you know, she edited the magazine. She was deeply involved with Emerson. She was deeply involved with Hawthorne, who, you know, was and was not part of that community. She was a kind of lightning rod for their thinking. She brought them German poetry and German literature. She read Latin and Greek just like the rest of them. When she left here, she went to New York to be the editor of the Herald Tribune. Horace Greeley hired her. She had to have a chaperone, because she was a woman, right? She became arguably the first woman foreign correspondent. She went to England, she met Carlyle, she went to France, she covered the Roman Revolution. She was an extraordinary woman. And yet, somebody said to me the other day, who was Margaret Fuller? You know, and she had a huge impact on all these people. And then, of course, as you'll find out when you read the book, she had a sad, awful, haunting death. And that, if anything, increased her impact on these people. So much so that Henry James called her the Margaret ghost, because they just couldn't get over it. And it's horrible. And it's the most horrible thing in the book, I think. I mean, haunting. Let's say haunting. Horrible isn't a good word. But I don't know why. Do not forget Margaret Fuller. Yes.
Didn't one of the transcendentalists ask her to come back?
Well, Emerson, she and Emerson had this
Can you repeat the question?
relation. What?
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Did one of the transcendentalists ask Margaret Fuller to come back? She and Emerson were very good friends. She lived, if you've been in the Emerson house, she lived in that guest room that's right on the bottom with the chenille bedspread. I care a lot about furniture. She, you know, would pursue, and Emerson would retreat, and then Emerson would pursue, and she would retreat. And she also was very involved with Hawthorne, which of course pissed Emerson off. But anyway, to answer your question, when she went to Europe, Emerson followed her. Now, let me put it another way. When she went to Europe, Emerson also went to Europe and started writing her letters saying, come home with me, let's go back to Concord. And then, at this point, she was pregnant. So she would write him back saying, I've been sick, but not telling him what kind of sick. And then he would write her saying, well, then you've got to come back to Concord right away. And then she had a child, an illegitimate child, with her lover. And then she was on her way back to Concord when her ship was wrecked. So Emerson was always telling her to come back, and she was coming back, but she didn't make it. Yes?
I've lived in Concord for about 10 years, so I'm learning about Concord. I don't know very much about Bloomsbury. Could Bloomsbury be considered an English Concord?
I guess so. You know, the question is, could Bloomsbury be considered an English Concord? Yes, I think that would be the way to put it. There was a lot of controversy over titling this book. My editor and I wanted to call it American Parnassus, because that's what we felt Concord was. It was thought that nobody knew what Parnassus meant. So we took Bloomsbury as a code word for genius cluster. But the truth is, the Concord people were first, and they were better writers, much better writers. I mean, those Bloomsbury guys, they had one good writer. So I feel the superiority of the Concord group to the Bloomsbury group very deeply, and I apologize for the title of the book. How's that?
I wasn't casting this further.
Well, I mean, I kind of wish, I mean, there's nothing about the English Bloomsbury in the book, and I do feel that the Concord group was so much more extraordinary than the Bloomsbury group, but I think it's code for a group of amazing writers. Yes.
What did Thoreau think of Louisa May Alcott? You said that he was Laurie.
Right, well, he was
What
her.
was that relation?
He was her teacher. Thoreau taught at Concord Academy, and he was, what was he, 14 years, 15 years, who knows, older than Louisa. So he was her revered older teacher, and Thoreau,
I must have misunderstood you then. Who was Laurie in actuality?
well, according to Martha Saxton, Laurie in actuality was based on Thoreau, who was living in the Emerson house for a year at a time.
Okay.
So he would have come across the street and done all the things that Laurie did, been their good friend. But their first encounter, Louisa's first encounter with Thoreau, was when she came here in 1840. She was 8, and her father enrolled them in Thoreau's school that he ran with his brother John. And Thoreau was this enchanting teacher, apparently. I mean, he would say, "School's out," and they'd all go off and, you know, catch fish and frogs and go off on a hay wagon, and it sounds good to me too.
Right.
So,
But he wasn't her contemporary as a child, you know. as
no,
a
he was much older than she was, and Emerson was even older. They were both older. And there is absolutely no proof that any of these people ever had anything to do with each other physically. None. Zero. I looked and looked and looked. And there's one place in Margaret Fuller's journal where she's been with Hawthorne, and she says, "I love him so much. I would love him here. I would love him there. XXX." And they're big X's, right? Not like little kissy X's, but that's it. And I think this is why 2 people have written novels about these people, because one feels that one knows what happened, the documentation isn't there, so if you write a novel, you can say what you want. Which they both did, as I'm sure you know. Amy Brown's novel about Lydia and Emerson, and Geraldine Brooks's novel about Bronson Alcott. Very sexy books. Yes.
You said something about Moby Dick and Melville, and Melville was a very successful novelist at that point, and then he met his great friend Hawthorne, and then Hawthorne influenced him to write Moby Dick?
Well, Melville had already embarked on Moby Dick, and they met when Hawthorne was not good with neighbors, so he was always moving quite quickly to the next place, so he left Concord Emerson took their house away, basically. I mean, that's what I think. And they went back to Salem, and then they found a place to live in the Berkshires, and they went there, and then they got in a fight over who owned the apples in the orchard, and then they came back to Concord, et cetera, et cetera. So, but when they were in the Berkshires, right after Margaret Fuller was drowned, Hawthorne met Melville, who had already written some positive reviews of Hawthorne's work. Melville just worshipped Hawthorne. He just worshipped him. And he wrote all kinds of positive things about him, including many things that in which scholars have tried to find sexual denotations. You know, Hawthorne is the plant whose roots nourish my earth, that kind of thing, to paraphrase. So Melville was a very successful adventure writer at that time, sort of a Tom Clancy type writer, and Melville had been everywhere. He had been around the world, he had lived among cannibals. Hawthorne had been nowhere. You know, and so Hawthorne was sort of fascinated by him, right? Melville had done all this stuff, and Melville was writing or beginning to write a book about his time on the Acushnet, and of course the wreck of the Essex. And so Hawthorne said to him, again I'm paraphrasing, "Don't just write another one of these adventure books, make this a metaphor for life." And Melville did, and of course that was the end of his career. there's a very sad story when Hawthorne was friends with the president. Franklin Pierce was his Bowdoin friend, and when Franklin Pierce became president, he gave Hawthorne the plum job of consul at Liverpool. And the Hawthornes went to live there with servants and all kinds of things that they weren't used to. And Melville came to visit, and he brought a manuscript that he thought maybe Hawthorne could help him get published. Ooh, that really got to me, you know. I mean, but on the other hand, Moby Dick is an amazing book, as we now know. So, yes.
Do you think Louisa May Alcott was trying to figure out what a teenager was? You know, somebody said recently that Mickey Rooney was was the first teenager. There weren't any teenagers. There were children, and then there were adults, and smaller adults. And then along came Mickey Rooney, who had special clothes. And, you know, I just sort of wonder sociologically if she was reaching for something.
The question is, was Louisa May Alcott trying to figure out what a teenager was, because there weren't any teenagers in 1868. There weren't. There were children and there were adults. Teenager is another brand new thing. I know, I have one. And he's wonderful. I think that we could credit her with inventing the teenager. In other words, she wrote one of the first books in which women, you know, in which children were treated as if they were important, just the way in which she wrote one of the first books in which women were treated as if they were important. So there's another scalp for her belt. Right. Thanks. Yes.
2 questions. Was it hard for you to let go of all of them when you finished the book? And we were able to come to Concord last summer for Sophia's reinternment.
I didn't come for her reinternment last summer. I just couldn't, but I did stop in Concord last summer and come to the bookstore and buy some books. But I miss these people very much. In fact, I very much wanted to write a biography of Louisa May Alcott so that I could keep coming to Concord, but there's another one in the works. And I'm hoping that that one will just not be very good. But yes, I miss them a lot, and I miss Concord a lot, and it's kind of sad to be here. I mean, it's great to be here, but I miss, you know, being here and thinking. And also, there are new things that are still being discovered. I mean, as you all know, Thoreau by accident burned down 300 acres of Concord. Remember that?
Yeah.
So some letters from the people whose acres were burned down have just surfaced in Providence. Some of the Wheeler family. So, you know, there are things coming up all the time. And so maybe I could just write it again. Yes.
Yeah. I have a question, and maybe it's based on a misapprehension of your career as a writer, so correct me if it is, but could you say a little bit about your experience of writing fiction and then writing this piece of nonfiction?
The question is about my experience writing fiction and my experience writing nonfiction. You know, I haven't written fiction in a long, long time. I haven't written fiction since I had my second child because I found that I couldn't. So I haven't written fiction since 1989 because I couldn't. And some people can, some people can't. I couldn't. So that child is going to go to college in 2 years, and I'm thinking maybe I'll be able to write fiction again, but I love nonfiction. I think nonfiction is 1,000 times more exciting than fiction. I think in nonfiction we're just beginning to discover what it is. I think in memoir we're just beginning to discover what it is. I think a memoir is an extraordinarily interesting political form because of memoir. People who never had a voice before, women, minorities, younger girlfriends of great writers have a voice. They get to tell their stories. These stories never got told before. All the stories we used to tell in the kitchen and the ladies' room are now getting told in books. I think that's fantastic. And I think there's a backlash. Of course that happens whenever there's something new in which new people's voices get heard. But I think in memoir, we're just beginning to discover what you can do. I mean, you could write a memoir of 10 minutes. Think about it. You know, Timothy Garton-Ash wrote a memoir out of his Stasi files from East Germany. So there are all kinds of things you could do with memoir that are just beginning to be discovered. So I love nonfiction and I love memoir, but I have a novel in mind, but it's going to be a while before I can go back to it. But I haven't written fiction since my son was born. And it's totally worth it, don't get me wrong. You can't. I mean, I'm a big, the life comes before the art person. I've answered all their questions.
Doug, can you tell us, of the people that you wrote about, who did you find the most likable?
I guess Margaret Fuller and Louisa. Well, Louise is so great. You know, and it's so amazing that in the end, you know, she succeeds and she's able to bail her family out, and you know, she went to Europe before, but as a companion, but then she can do what she wants and write what she wants. But Margaret Fuller really just broke my heart. And I think for me, this question of what is a woman, which was different in 1850 and the same, is a fascinating question. And women who don't do what women are supposed to do fascinate me and inspire me. So as a woman who didn't do what I was supposed to do, I, you know, love both those women. But I think Margaret was just so fierce, and she's definitely the one.
Did they have a harder time because they were women?
Yes.
Their challenges were
Yes.
greater then.
Yes, a much harder
Did you
time.
find yourself getting angry as you learned about that?
Well, everybody thought that women were inferior, including the women, you know, and they were abolitionists, but they didn't see that in many cases there were slaves in their own households, you know. I mean, women couldn't do this, and women could, you know, Margaret Fuller she was allowed to use the Harvard Library. Forget going to Harvard. There was no question of any of these women going to college, you know. They let her into the library. So that's a little irritating. You know, I mean, I think it was very hard to be a woman who didn't just, you know, get married and become the loyal wife. And I think it's still hard. Well, maybe not. Yes.
I've always been amazed that Bronson Alcott seemed to go through life the way he did. And in your book, I got the same feeling from you that I don't have a good feeling for what made him so special to the people around him, that they would put up with him.
Did you all hear that question? Well, you know, I don't like him as you intuit. Perhaps because I also am the daughter of a great man. So maybe it's just a projection. You know, but I don't love this I am a great man business with the cape and the stick and the hair and the yes little girl, you know. And he did, you know, he believed that blondes were angels and the dark-haired people were bad. I mean, you know, there are a lot of ways to nail him. But I think what it must have been is that, and his writing is appalling, but I think that when he gave conversations, which he did, or when he spoke, or as a teacher, he must have been brilliant, because Emerson was really impressed by him. And Emerson was no slouch. So I think that Bronson Alcott must have had some kind of incredible magnetism, some charisma that didn't survive 150 years, that didn't go onto the page, because people were very impressed by him. And he was, you know, he did experiment with different kinds of education, and he was very strong for abolition, and he was kind of fearless. So that's what I think. That's what I concluded, is that in person, if any of us had met him, we would have been completely enchanted. Yes, were you going to answer that question?
Well, not answer, but what sticks with me, I read it first of all, he wrote a diary which was 5 million words long or something.
Mm-hmm.
But he had a great respect for time. And there is a sentence that sort of rings in my ear. He respected time, and time was good to him, because at age 60, he became famous. He started his lectures. People came here from all over the country and from abroad. So for 20 years, at the end of his life, he was able to give and say very interesting things that people really appreciated.
Well,
It just
again, I
stayed
think
with
that-
me that he respected time somehow, and I
Respected
forgot how he
time.
did that, but and
Well,
time was good
I
to
think you're right,
him.
that it was in his personal appearances that there was obviously something that is lost. Because to read about him, and I don't know if you all read the Geraldine Brooks novel about him, but that didn't really make me like him a whole lot better. And she did write a lovely piece in the New Yorker about him, where it kind of led with all his credits. He was a great experimenter in education, and he was one of the first members of the Anti-Slavery Society. But I don't know, I resent him on Louisa's behalf. Can't really help it.
I like it.
But it seems to me Louisa
She loved him.
loved him.
She loved him.
And I can't think of a better critic
Then Louisa.
in terms of that, so.
She loved him, but
And Abba through all the years.
wow.
And, well,
Stayed with him. She stayed with him. I wouldn't
And
say, whether she loved, but Louisa.
He
certainly-
went down for her when she was sick in Washington. He brought her
He
back.
went to Washington and brought her back.
and the
For example.
educational philosophy, he was way ahead of his time. I mean,
He was way ahead
today,
of his
a
time.
man who would allow black children and bring up sex education, well.
He was way ahead of his time.
But in 1833,
He was way
Clearly
ahead of
it
his
didn't
time,
work.
see? You who asked the question?
there are Bronson fan clubs.
He went down to, well, I know that once when I was at Orchard House, I asked whoever was at that little desk why they didn't have Martha Saxton's biography of Louisa May Alcott. I'm sure the person who answered is in this room. And they said, because she wasn't nice to Bronson. So there's a Bronson-Alcott tension that,
Also, since 1977, there are
Things have
other
changed. That's
approaches
true.
to looking
That's
at
true.
people.
But
not
many
just
people think
psychoanalytic,
Bronson,
but, yeah.
I'm just in the, I'm not so sure camp. In fact, but as I said, maybe it's because I'm the daughter of a great man, so, yeah.
Well, one of the things that Richardson said in his book about Bronson was that he had a way, he believed that God was in each child, and that it was his job to bring the godliness out. So that really kind of blew me away.
That's
I really
amazing.
believe in that.
I think as an educator, he was clearly way ahead of his time, but foolish. No.
Not very practical.
But is that our perspective? I think I wonder too about today, looking at the people with our, and I mean, just really, I would really like to know, I mean, what was it really like for
Well,
these
I think
people
we
without
would
our
all
projections?
like to
on
know what it was really like, and certainly it was different.
Yeah.
I mean, we'd all be dead, or I would. I mean, just for openers, they didn't have central heating, they didn't have dentists, they didn't have any medicine to speak of, they didn't have much to eat. It was cold in the winter, it was hot in the summer. I mean, it was a very, very different,
They had TV.
what we call, they didn't have TV, right, they didn't have the internet,
No,
it
no,
was,
they had TV.
oh, they had TV, not TV, there you go. Yes, did you have a question?
I was wondering about what you thought the Fruitlands experience, how that affected their marriage. It seemed, I'd been reading Odell Shepherd.
I love that book.
Yes, and it speaks of how he didn't eat or he almost wanted to die after that experience.
The Odell Shepherd biography of Bronson Alcott, 1936, is priceless.
Yeah.
And it's the one where he says that Hawthorne in a group of people always looked like a criminal in a convention of detectives. But yes, I think that the Fruitlands experiment shifted the balance of the marriage because Bronson just went into a funk.
Yeah.
Or depression, whatever is the friendly thing to call it. And Abba had to kind of get the family together and get them out of there and move them to Stillwater and figure out what to do. She was an amazingly forceful woman, and I think at that
Louisa.
point, Louisa and her
Yeah.
and Bronson's wife.
I'm sorry.
So I think it did shift at that point.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, the Odell Shepherd book is so great. Yes, in the back.
You don't talk a whole lot about Abba Alcott in the book. I mean, you mention her in conjunction with the other characters, but I always, certainly from reading Little Women, I had a great deal of respect for her. What were your feelings after writing the book?
Well, I also have a great deal of respect for her, but she's not the mother in Little Women. In other words, Little Women is not, it's fiction.
Right.
And I think that a lot of great writing comes from yearning. That's just my theory. And I think in Little Women you can see her yearning for the mother she didn't have, for the father she didn't have, for the servants she didn't have, Hannah, right? For the sister with the quiet death she didn't have. So I think there's this tremendous force in Little Women of yearning for what might have been but wasn't. But yes, I ended up with a great deal of respect for Abba Alcott. I didn't, it's a short book. She probably deserves her own book.
Yes.
Yes.
How did you, in your mind, work with the issue around time from the standpoint of these people living when they did? Like I noticed in reading, you mentioned the death of Margaret. That's when knowledge before she was developed as a character.
Right. Well,
And I was a little shocked. And then I was thinking I was being required to move in and out of space and time in the way that movie with Meryl Streep in it, where we...
The Hours? Yeah, The Hours.
Yeah, and then another.
Right. The Hours. The Hours.
And so that in movies, I have a lot of aids, but I've never read a book where it's worked for me. And so I guess I wanted to see all that in the beginning and an introduction, and then I get to live with those people.
Well, this woman is asking about the structure of the book. Is that a fair way to put your question?
Sure.
And it took a year for me to figure out the structure of the book, and it's still not perfect, obviously. I didn't want to, I had 5 people and about 20 years, 28 years, and I didn't want to just write 5 profiles, because how boring would that be? I wanted the reader to experience the events in the way that the people in the book experienced the events. So, there's a lot of repetition in the book. In fact, there's a note to the reader at the front of the book that explains this. So, you need to see Hawthorne when he finds out that Margaret Fuller is dead. You need to see Emerson when he finds out that Margaret Fuller is dead. And then you need to have the whole story of how Margaret Fuller drowned. So you actually get it 3 times. So there's a lot of repetition in the book because there's the chronological line. What I did, finally, is I made a chronological line. This is explained in the book, though, I have to say. I mean, I knew it was complicated. And then I had 5 people, and I did each of them 4 times. So you get each of the 5 people 4 times over this period of 28 years. And then I went back and tried to adjust it so that it would be as smooth as it could possibly be. But there was no way, except writing 5 different profiles, to make it easy, as simple to follow as you would have liked. I just couldn't write 5 separate profiles because that's not what interested me. What interested me was the impact of what happened on the characters.
Well,
So,
it didn't hurt the New Testament.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know about that. But anyway, that's what I did. It took a long time to figure it out. I mean, I tortured myself, and I had a wall full of diagrams, and, you know, whatever. I'm not gonna defend it. Neither am I gonna attack it. Questions?
Thank you very, very much.
You know, certain things that happen to the wall that people sort of recognize as something actually.
Well, and they're all over the place, and you know, I read about them in all different fields.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much.
Well, you're full of
inspirational. I actually created what I wanted to just read an outside about where and sweet house was built in public fast I just love it. I mean, I used to when I was in Vermont. But anyway, it's just really fun.
creating perennials, or anything, you know, or have a lot of stuff that they see themselves, and you know, I have two grizzlies. So that's good.
No.
One of the novels. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
I'll check it out. Which one? Which one?
It's always beckoning. Yeah, well, I always try to things kind of sequential. Yeah, but a lot of it also depends on the weather and what kind of a summer we have, and if we have enough rain, and if it's not too hot. And, you know,
My term was
last year we had. Last year, because the winter, we didn't have much snow during the winter, that we lost quite a few things because they were just hard. And actually, the winter before that was really, really, really snowy. That spring was just glorious. The ground was so.
My days go by, you know.
I still have those, yeah, I had some days ago, just one little patch. But I have other things that have been coming up, you know, and since I didn't know I was putting up bushes. Well, I was that's the sign.
I was just going to have it done with
Oh, well, I go and sit on Emerson's cliff right here, and I have a cliff boat. If you take the if you get the map, and you take the Esker Trail, which is when you go around the pond, like if you go around and you pass by the house site, on the pond path, you come to a point with the pond path. It's continues, you left, but there's a steep ascent. If you go up that, then you're left. That's the Esker Trail. The Emerson. Right on.